Hello, hello. Welcome to the Black Sheep Live. It is me, Salome Sibone, your host, artist, speaker, co-founder of the Black Sheep, where we promote all things individualism in a society that is sickened with collectivism. And one of the things that is making our society so sick is that we don't realize how much myths drive us. There's a lot of emphasis on the facts and rationality and the reality of the situation that we're discussing. But I think most of us are starting to realize that we're not really dealing with facts most of the time. We're dealing with people's emotions and we're dealing with people's stories about the world. And those stories may or may not include facts. And so I've been reading Joseph Campbell, which I highly recommend. And we're going to talk about Campbell's ideas about myths and how myth is a kind of innate human tool for making sense of the world. And I'm going to talk about how we've kind of lost touch with this tool, but that doesn't mean we don't still use it without realizing. And so, when you look at the news and you see all this drama, these good versus evil dynamics talking about politics, where Elon Musk is suddenly a Nazi because he kind of did a Nazi salute, right? So he must be a Nazi, and there's a fascist takeover because Trump was elected democratically. And the only reason why people are leftist is because they're mentally ill, depraved individuals. This kind of extreme black and white emotional rhetoric is evidence that we're more in the realm of myth than we are in the realm of facts and rationality. And so, as much as we hear about misinformation, people have the wrong ideas, and if we just controlled the information, then they would be right like us. Misinformation is one of the biggest mistakes that we could make today in trying to understand why people come to the ideas that they do. It's myth information that we should be focusing on, which is these grand narratives that we simply fit all the details in while maintaining the structure that is, we are the good people, those are the evil people, we must triumph over those evil people for the sake of the world and our society and goodness. And you see this in so much political rhetoric today. And it's so funny because you see it from everyone. There really is no group that I'm aware of that acts from the idea that they're the bad guys. And no, they're just bad and they're just doing bad things and they're just fully owning up to that. And they're going to go out there and they're going to mess things up for the good guys because they're just the bad guys. No one really operates like that. Everybody's myth puts them as the hero, as the good guy that is going to triumph over those bad guys over there. And this kind of myth is actually really dangerous because it allows us to do just about anything as the quote unquote good guys. And you see this kind of myth trotted out very often during wartime, post 9/11, post October 7th, post any type of war or traumatic event where there's an instinct to get people to rally around one side and to immediately demonize anybody that doesn't toe the line. That's when you get these especially black and white narratives around who is good and who is bad. And of course, in service of the good, then we, the good guys, grant ourselves the powers to triumph over the bad, very often by flouting the individual rights, the human dignity, and the laws of engagement that are required for being a civilized society. And so this is the kind of myth that when you recognize what is actually going on there, instead of getting caught up with the facts and being like, okay, well, yes, 9/11 was bad, but maybe we should take this approach that's more efficacious, da da da. You're acting on this level, but the myth is acting on this level. And you can't win at this level when you're trying to fight at this level. And that is the problem with not grappling with the degree to which we are driven by myth, by story. And this isn't like some fanciful artistic idea that I, nor Campbell, nor Jung, who Campbell often draws from, came up with out of nowhere. There's neuroscience to show that we process information better if it comes in that narrative structure. Why do you think we watch movies? What better evidence could you have that we are a storytelling species than the fact that we spend so much time and effort and money making stories? So we are not taking this seriously, and I think we should take this seriously. So that's what we are going to do in this live stream. I'm going to break down the role of myth in how we understand the world. But I also want to talk about how not just collectively as a society, we use myth to make sense of the world, and how often that causes problems when we're dealing with politics, but how we use myth as individuals. You also tell a story about your life and yourself. And a lot of psychotherapy is dedicated simply to the pursuit of making that story a more healthy, functional one, and how a lot of the problems that a person can have in their life comes from having a warped personal myth. There's great writing on this by Rollo May, who talks about the role of myth for an individual in pursuing their goals in life. All right, so just so you know, I am streaming on multiple platforms. We're on Rumble, we are on X, on YouTube, and on Instagram, and now also on Substack. So we are everywhere. So you can sign up to wetheblacksheep.com, subscribe there so that you get notifications of these live streams, so that you get the text that I've written along with it, so you can dive deeper into the subject, and so you don't miss subsequent live streams, and you stay up to date on those things. And let me know if you have any sense of the way myth is running rampant in our society today, because I don't think I'm alone in noticing this. All right, let's jump into Campbell's ideas on myth. So you may have heard of Joseph Campbell, and he has many famous works, including The Hero of a Thousand Faces. I believe that's a title. I'm currently reading his book, The Pathways to Bliss, which I think is actually like a collection of his essays or lectures. And it's a really great introduction to him if you are looking for that, because you will be able to dive in a more like cursory, less intense way. Because if you look at Hero of a Thousand Faces, or that, whatever the title of the book is that I'm butchering, it's like real, it's a thick boy. So that can be very daunting. And this one that I'm reading, very thin, very nice, very light, easy reading. You just jump in, you jump out, really great. But in this book, what he does is talk about the role of myth in many other societies. So he talks about primal societies, like more primitive, ancient societies. Then he also compares Eastern societies to Western societies. And you see these different myths, which is just so fun also because he does like comparative religious studies. And in that, you especially get a sense of how much the different religious stories have these recurring themes in them. And the fact that these themes recur, like the resurrection, the importance of symbolism, like the body of Christ being the communion wafer, the wine, and things like this that are actually not unique to Christianity, but are even older in their themes from different religions and different practices. And it shows you that there are ways that we convey information throughout time, like throughout culture. And we have largely moved away from that in terms of conveying information through myth in our society. We convey information in the way that I'm doing it right now, which is I'm talking to you very literally. I am telling you the facts that I think are true, And those facts are disputable because they may or may not be true. Myth is not that same kind of information conveying tool. It's not necessarily meant to be perfectly factually accurate. And this is the problem that we have gotten into now with modern societies moving away from religion, because where it once explained society to us, explained the world, why do things work the way they are? Well, they work this way because the gods made them this way, and this is the story of the origins and things like that. Well, now we know because of science that those stories aren't true. And so it has kind of kicked out a pillar of what religion once did for us, which is explain the world. And so now, for those of us in more modern societies that don't still believe these stories about how the world was created or how society came to be formed, we look to science, we look to facts, we look to this literal form of conveying information to understand and navigate our world. But that doesn't mean that the myth part of our brain is not still on and not still functioning. And you see this a lot, this intersection of the two, of the literal fact-based information and the mythological narrative structure of conveying information collide in media, in social media, in news media, where yes, we're talking about information, but there's often these story structures that convey emotional information that you're supposed to take away along with the facts. So for instance, I think a great example of this is like the freak out over Elon Musk supposedly doing a Nazi salute. Now, if you're a person that is grounded in the world, you know that it's highly unlikely that someone like Elon Musk would just be a secret Nazi and decide like, hey, you know what? Fuck it. I'm just going to salute on stage and just create a huge amount of problems in my life, in the administration's appearance. Just, let me just going to throw a whole wrench in everything that I'm trying to work for. And yeah, make myself look like a Nazi, because that's a very rational thing to do, right? And so this is one of these Occam's razor type of things, which I think I might be getting the razor wrong, but one of those razors, perhaps Occam's razor, is that don't attribute to malice what could be more accurately attributed to stupidity. And it's highly likely that Elon Musk, like notable autistic savant type of character, just did like a weird, awkward gesture. But when you look at the way a lot of the media approached this, it was narrativized to turn it into this grand emblem of a doomsday in the horizon. The fact that the Reich has now taken over. Look, they're flagrantly showing what they truly believe. I mean, there really is this like strange conspiratorial instinct in some people to believe that things are best explained by the most absolutely malevolent and complicated explanation possible, rather than what usually is true, which is it's the less complicated, more obvious, sensical explanation that makes sense. So rather than Elon Musk be some kind of secret, devious Nazi who doesn't actually really do any Nazi things and doesn't really promote any Nazi policies, but will throw up a Sieg Heil moment in like a super important moment, but then not really do any Nazi stuff after that. That is one story. But then you have the other story would be that he's just this awkward billionaire who has now been thrust into the public light and doesn't really know what to do with his arms during important public speech, which, by the way, is a very, very, very common problem for people that are speaking publicly. Like, I can tell you, as soon as you're doing some kind of public thing, your arms are just like, what do I do with arms? Like, why are they here? So that is actually a very normal thing to deal with. It's like doing weird arm stuff when you're in an uncomfortable speaking situation. But now you have the narrativizing, right? So what is a more juicy narrative? What is a more juicy story? It's that, well, actually, I'm living through this horrific, dark moment where all that is good is being lost because this army of evil people has now taken over, and now they're just taunting us to our faces by showing the evil that they are going to be enacting. That is a myth. And the way that you know that that is a myth is because of the over-reliance on the attribution of malice and evil. Most people are not actually that evil. Most people are kind of normal. Like, they're bad in a normal way, right? Which is, they're probably kind of self-interested in ways that might be ugly or inconvenient for others. They are egotistical in ways that make them insufferable or rude or prone to conflict. They have traumatic issues in their life that make them destructive and make them lean on destructive coping mechanisms. You know, the stuff that you see generally in your life from people who are kind of annoying or have problems or are destructive in some way. It's not this grand narrative of evil that, like, the heart of the person is simply black. You know, like, as soon as you get into the realm of that level of depravity being ascribed to the enemy group, you're in the realm of myth. And this is something that you can see all over the political spectrum now. And it's kind of an odd thing because I don't personally know why we haven't reached a position that allows us to realize, hey, we're not in our rational brains now. We are very much in the realm of storytelling, and that's not productive if we're trying to actually ascertain the truth of the situation here, which is not found by simply ascribing malice and evil to all the people that we disagree with. So one of the things that is important to understand about how myth making intersects with tribalism is that tribes organize themselves around myths historically. That's largely what keeps a tribe together. What keeps a people together is their shared myth. And their shared myth is really just a placeholder for, like, their shared understanding of the world, their shared sense of values. In many ways, this is why we have so many problems in our culture now, is because we don't have these shared myths. We don't have these shared values. We have competing myths and competing values. And so you see that play out in this very, like, tribal political discourse by which people ascribe pure malice to anyone who is on the other side of the political aisle. And so what do you do when you have these myths running rampant in the place of a kind of rational, fact-based discussion, which is super odd, right? Because you have, like, on the one hand, let me get my wine because we're about to get into discussing the role of the media, the role of the legacy media in the proliferation of destructive myths in our society, which is in some ways one of the most destructive things for our culture, is just the fact that we have been fed these warring myths under the guise of it being neutral information. And it's very much not neutral information. Let me take a sip. Bear with me. Anyway, so you look at the media today and you see this push to narrativize events. And this is what has led to a lot of mistrust in the legacy media, is because a lot of people have realized you are pushing a story. You are pushing a worldview. And that's different from simply reporting the facts, from simply telling me what happened, what is true, what do we know to be confirmed. Once you get into the realm of narrativizing with those facts, now you are spreading a myth. And for a lot of people, they were not buying the myth that the legacy media was spreading to them. This myth that simply trust the experts, simply trust the most elite in your society, and disregard the fact that we're telling you that you should lose rights over not taking a vaccine that we just came out with, you're the bad person. Actually, your neighbor who is not wearing a mask in their front yard by themselves, that's the enemy. They hate our livelihood. They hate the way that we live. They want bad things for us all. That was the kind of myth making that we saw during the pandemic. And that was probably what led to some of the most historic drops in trust in the media, because there was this extra flagrant attempt to just like sell stories, just sell an entire worldview. And of course, when you get a little too reckless with the myth making and forget that you're supposed to be reporting facts, and those facts eventually come home to contradict the myth that you tried to sell, some people are going to notice that. And that is when you lose them. And so now we have a society of like incredibly fractured myths. And what you have to understand about this is that it's not even as simple as just, oh, the red myth and the blue myth. It's not just left versus right anymore. That has been long gone. That is like, in my mind, normie tribalism. It's like left versus right. I wish we were still just left versus right, because it is right versus right, left versus left within those political groups already. And the reason often for that is, again, because there are values that are not shared even within those political groups. And because we take in so much information today, it is so much easier for us to end up on different pages. And I don't really know. I don't have an answer for this. I don't actually know what we do with the fact that we take in so much information that it's likely that most people don't have a fairly similar view of what's going on in their own country now, because it depends where they get their information on the things. Once upon a time, most people in the country got their information in the very same place. And so unless you simply didn't get that information, you weren't on a different page in terms of, no, I have a competing story of what's going on. Yours is wrong, mine is true. There was a lot more cohesion in the stories that we held about reality and about our society and about each other. And these stories are just like the thing that drives everything. It's why I think that the focus on misinformation was just so silly, but also it's like so devious, because in some ways it's really just like an attempt to control the narrative. The idea of like misinformation is just inherently flawed, because if you know how information worked, you are always holding some piece of misinformation at some time, because nobody has a perfectly accurate view of the world. It's impossible to have that. And so we're all operating on some sense of misinformation at some point. So the idea of demonizing misinformation itself, as if that's something that you can actually control and you can stop people from believing, is to misunderstand how information and the receival of information itself works. Rather, what we need is to have this intellectual humility where we understand that we're all going to be wrong about stuff. And so we are here in this place where we have these competing stories, and it's only getting more competitive as the places where we get our stories fracture ever more. So it's like, did you watch that podcast? Do you watch this show? Did you read this article? Do you read that publication? There are so many places to get different perspectives on things from that it's like, I highly doubt that we're going to get more to a place of cohesion in the ways that we see the world ever again. And so then where do you go from there, right? That is the place that I am trying to reach, which is bring awareness to the fact that what we are doing is creating stories all the time. And if you have that awareness of the fact that you are a storytelling animal, that is what humans do to make sense of their world, is they create narrative structures and they create categories that they can place things into. And so one of the problems that I see largely with left-wing myths is that they end up creating these rigid buckets where they place enemies into, and these people that they place into those enemy buckets very often aren't actually enemies. And this often stems out of the need to categorize the world into oppressed versus oppressor, which is itself a myth. So that is not a fact. It's not a fact that the world can be discerned into oppressed versus oppressor. That is a theory, an idea, a narrative structure, a myth. It is something that we might believe and start using as a tool to make sense of our world. And this is where it gets so important to understand how that function works, because you can then start to ascertain for yourself, is this myth that I'm using actually functional? Does it help me to make sense of the world? Is this making it more clear to me? Or do I find myself avoiding information? Do I find myself demonizing people, friends, family, who have never done anything to me to lead to that demonization, but merely don't fit into my myth and thus need to be put into the enemy bucket? This is something that we've seen a lot with the rise of this critical social justice framework that pushes that oppressed versus oppressor myth. And so if that becomes your dominant myth for understanding the world, then you have to start filtering in the information you get from the world into that framework. And it's such a destructive thing because it doesn't work. And that's the thing about myths, right? Is they're an artful thing. You can actually be the storyteller of your life if you admit to yourself what you are doing, which is seeking a myth by which to understand the world. And a myth is something we can edit. It's something you should be editing. And so this is why I always advocate for values instead of the Salome, why are you reiterating the essay I sent you almost verbatim without any credit? I have no idea what you're talking about. What essay? I want to know now. The essay. I don't remember. I probably didn't read it because I don't read any of my DMs or anything. I'm really, really bad about it. But if that essay was from Joseph Campbell, then that would make sense because that is who I started discussing in the beginning of this live stream. But anyway, before I lose my track on the myths and the need to edit her myths, because there's two levels to this, right? There's the individual level and there's the collective level. Not a lot that we can do about the collective level. I'm gonna keep it real with you. Not a lot we can do. You can read The Black Sheep. That is a good place to start, because one of the things that I think makes my publication great is that it operates on a myth that actually works. And I am utilizing the myth that has worked for the United States since its inception. I am utilizing the myth that has worked for me since I adopted it. And for those that don't know, I used to be a very woke leftist. And I was a woke leftist before everybody else was a woke leftist. And I kind of almost want credit for that, because it's now everybody's woke, right? Now everybody wants to tell me about white privilege and cultural appropriation and blah, blah, blah. I was the annoying person telling other people about that before anybody even knew what it was. I was watching people get canceled before anybody even called it cancel culture. So a little credit for being really early to the bad idea would be nice. But nonetheless, I had that idea. I was operating on that myth, and it was not working for me. And that's ultimately what led me to drop it, was because I realized I'm just taking L after L in my life. I'm resentful. I'm not doing the things that I value. I'm bitter about my station in life, and I feel like I'm entitled to more, but I actually don't do anything to get there. And the disconnect between that just makes me both self-loathing, but also bitter towards others. This is not working. And it's leading me to want to demonize people that I don't even know. Like, it's like, oh, this is the fault of the rich. This is the fault of like the privileged, quote unquote. And it's like, I mean, what better chance do I have as a person born into a uniquely free country, not born into abject poverty, not born with like some serious debilitation. And I'm like, well, let's slow down there. Okay, let's check your white privilege. It's like, that is not a functional myth. And so eventually I realized that as I started to encounter other ways of seeing the world. Luckily, I wasn't so attached to that worldview that I wasn't able to let it go. And I think it's harder for people now because now you have an entire cultural ecosystem. You have a media ecosystem that's pushing these ideas, these myths. It's really bad because I didn't have that when I was younger and I was like adopting the woke ideas. I was just on Tumblr and was like, that makes sense. That sounds about right. That's probably why people are poor. It's because other people are rich. You know, I didn't have any other explanations. And so I wasn't as particularly attached to it, and there wasn't as much pressure as there was at least in the last few years, where it's like now, in some ways, we're so much more polarized because as this idea has become more recognized for how bad it is, the people that are pushing it push it that much harder because they don't want people to go to the quote unquote other side. And so the demonization of dissidents from that kind of like woke leftist worldview gets even harsher in some ways. And so whatever, that's what led me to write the whole black sheep idea, to come up with that, was that the courage to kind of step away from a dysfunctional group and to go on your own journey to find what you care about, your values, your beliefs, and to forge a worldview of your own based on those values and beliefs, that is a very valuable process, both for the individual and for their society. So let me hear if you guys have seen any kind of these examples of myth making in the media. Because once you start to recognize the kind of like, we often call it tribalism, is what it gets described as in political rhetoric, which is just like, okay, pushing an us versus them narrative, pushing black and white thinking, the demonization of any outgroup just for the sake of them being an outgroup. That kind of tribalism often is wrapped up with myth-making narratives. And I think it's an odd thing to see in our media, because in some ways it's become so common that we often don't even kind of bat an eye at it anymore. But some of it is so egregious that it really just is blatant attempts to control the myth by which you navigate the world. And that is in some ways like a big red flag for me. And I'm going to discuss here shortly why. I want to check some of your responses here. Okay. All right, let's press on. All right. So let's talk about some of the more dangerous myths that I see proliferating in our culture. And I think the one that is the one that really makes me most concerned is just the kind of like good versus evil myth by which the right wing is portrayed as the same as Nazis. And it's just the most evil you could be is to be right wing, because fundamentally this already just misunderstands how the political spectrum works, which is that not everybody who is right wing technically is a fascist, let alone even like a conservative or something like that. you can be a libertarian and be right wing. And so I see often this kind of black and white simplification of the political spectrum where the division, very convenient, left versus right, turns into evil versus good. And so that kind of simplistic framework is just crack to the myth-making part of our brain who wants that simple good versus evil narrative. And that is one of the things that is the most dangerous, because when you believe yourself to be a righteous actor fighting against evil, you can grant yourself the allowance to do things that otherwise, in an objective framework, would be considered themselves evil. And you see this often with like the war in Gaza, where I see like ultra-Zionist figures talk about how, well, we just have to kill this many people who are innocent because it's just what must be done for the greater good. Or you saw the same rhetoric in the United States when there was pushing of the vaccine mandate, where it was like, well, some people just have to lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and lose the right to travel potentially if we get around to doing that, and which we will try because it's for the greater good. And this kind of black and white, evil versus good framework is very convenient for allowing you to be your worst self, supposedly in service of something good. And that's what's so dangerous about the kind of mythological thinking that often drives our politics, because we completely abandon principle. So if one values the principle of individual sovereignty, which is a person has the right to their own life, to direct their own life, then casualties who are innocent people are no longer simply, well, it's just what we have to do. Forcing people out of their livelihoods because you want to force a medication is no longer something that is ethically defendable. And that's if you operate on principles. The problem is often that we are much more conveniently operating in the realm of good versus evil, this mythological battle, which then, of course, allows us to make exceptions for things that otherwise we would say, well, don't do that to me. I don't want that principle negated when it comes to me or my loved ones. And so you see this kind of divorce from thinking in a more rational, long-term, principled way, and then thinking in a more mythological, short-term way that allows you to simply put everybody that is in your way, that does not conform to your beliefs or your group, in the enemy bucket. And if they're in the enemy bucket, well, you are a righteous actor. You simply must do what you have to do for the greater good of your good people. And it's a sad thing, because you'll see people who are good people fall into this framework of thinking, and it leads them to bad conclusions. And so as we get to the end of this live stream, I want to talk about curating your own myth, because this is probably the most important thing that we can do. And it's the thing that I think you actually have more control over, which is being conscious of the story you're telling yourself, of the story that you're creating to filter the world through. Because you are doing that. That's, I think, the first step for all of us, is to admit that we are storytelling creatures. This is what makes humans so fascinating and so powerful in some regard, is that we use stories to make sense of the complex world in complex ways, and then to share those stories with each other so that we can cooperate together. That is wonderful if those stories are mostly good. If those stories are mostly out of alignment with reality, that is very dangerous. That is how you get into the realm of mass murder, unnecessary wars, violence, famine, mass poverty, things like this that come about because some people take control and operate on a flawed myth about how the world works. And so, as individuals, we can do the first step, which is understanding I am a human being, which means I think in stories. And so, what does a story have? A story has a protagonist. A story has a villain. A story has good versus bad. A story has a narrative structure that moves the plot forward towards some good outcome, we hope, or some stories towards some inevitable doomsday outcome. There's no guarantee that your story ends with a happy ending. You may be one of the people that decides that your story is the one that ends with a sad ending. And that's one of the things that I would invite a person to question. And it's one of the stories that I think has actually got quite common, which is just things are bad, things are going in the wrong direction, and so they're probably going to go in the wrong direction for me, so I'm just going to do what I can in the meantime. Fuck it. Is that a great story? Like, would you want to be a part of that story? It's odd sometimes, like, if you look at it in that sense, which is, what is the story that I'm telling myself? What is the story that I tell about how the world works and my role in this world? You end up realizing, like, ooh, that's not a good story that you're telling yourself. Like, I wouldn't want to read that, let alone be in that story. And knowing that our stories are malleable, why not author a more efficacious story for yourself, a story that you want to be in? And this is the thing that most of us don't do, because I don't think we've reached this place as a culture or a civilization where we are on that meta level thinking, okay, we're thinking in stories, so why not use that to our advantage? Why not actually intentionally author these stories to work for us? And if that's the case, why would you have a story with a bad ending? That's not, why do you want to live in that story? So immediately, that's one of the things that I would say, nix the bad ending of your story. I recommend checking out one of my previous videos on cynicism, because cynicism very much is a function of myth making. It's a story we tell ourselves about how the world works and how things are going to happen, which of course you can't see the future. So the fact that you have some kind of narrative for predicting the future already implies that you are creating a story. That is a story, and a story is not a fact. So a story can be molded to be better, both for you and for others. And cynicism is one of those stories that really doesn't actually serve anyone except the people who would like to manipulate you by making you feel scared, desperate, and easily swayed by whatever information you can use to blame other people for how bad things are. So rather than fall into that trap, become the author of your story. Actually, that reminds me, Jordan Peterson had forever, like super long ago, this course where it was like called, what was it? Future authoring or self-authoring. And I mean, I recommend it. I think I bought it. I don't remember like really using it. The software was very like old school in a way that I couldn't get into. But the concept behind it is absolutely like solid. And the concept behind it was rethink the premises you hold about how the world works. Rewrite physically. Think through and rewrite the stories you tell yourself, about your role in your life, in your community, in your world. Like actually write the story that you want to be part of. It's an amazing idea because it gets to the core of how much we depend on story to make sense of the world and to actually live our lives. And so, like I said in the beginning, a lot of psychotherapy is just rewriting your individual myth, figuring out what in your myth does not work for living the kind of life that you want to live, which is presumably one that is good. And very often you'll find that people hold these myths where it's like, money is bad. The people that have money, they're bad people. People who want money are greedy. And then those people will wonder why they don't have financial success, why they're always struggling financially. And it's like, your story literally defines financial success as a villainous act. Do you want to be the villain? Probably not. Most people don't actively seek out being the villain in their own life. So you're probably playing out a story by which you're the good guy who simply never makes money because you're not one of those greedy assholes who pursues money. But what if you rewrote that story? What if money was a tool, something that you could use to help other people, something that came to you because you were providing something of value to others? Suddenly, it's not so evil to be wealthy. Suddenly, it does not make you a bad person to pursue wealth. So run a business well. Don't bleed money just because, oh, well, I don't really care that much about money anyway. So I'm going to pay extra for things that I could use a discount on, or that I could like cut the service and not pay extra for something I don't even use. Like these rational choices that in an unconscious way we might make to play out a dysfunctional story. And so this idea of authoring your own story is very, very deeply ingrained in psychotherapy, and also in some ways it's what art does for us. So when you are partaking in some kind of music or some kind of movie that like really moves you, what's moving you is very often the story, the narrative structure, like what it's moving you through. I think it's Socrates. No, I don't think it's Socrates. I think it's Aristotle that talks about, it's one of them. It's Aristotle, it's Socrates, or it's Plato. It's one of those that talks about the idea of catharsis. And catharsis in respect to art being something that allows us to go through this emotional process via the art and then gain some kind of relief as if we ourselves had gone through the experience. And it's an amazing thing because you really get that when you watch a movie where it's like this war gets fought and like all this drama and it's so intense and it takes place over like 100 years or something. And somehow at the end of the movie, you're like, yeah, I like the protagonist. Goodness is good. Humans can do good things. I feel motivated and uplifted. How does that make any sense if not for the fact that stories take you through the process with them and provide that kind of catharsis? Like you actually go through it together with the art. And so I would leave you with that idea. That is, as I wrap up, what I think we can really think about deeply is what stories we tell ourselves and what stories we have as a culture. Because very often it's the stories we tell ourselves individually that are also the stories that are getting amplified through culture. And the common stories that I see are deeply cynical, are stories that lead us to demonize like over half the population of our own country simply for having a very predictable, normal difference in politics from us. And that's not a efficacious story to tell unless you are trying to eventually end up in serious conflict with those people. Because if you tell a story where the person is a kind of irredeemable, evil enemy, what is the logical next step? What is the logical next outcome of a story in which you are against this evil opponent? Magical happy ending? Sudden random compromise with the evil, irredeemable opponent? No, it's conflict. It's domination, one versus the other. And so when we think through what is the logical conclusion of the story that I'm telling myself about this, There's a lot more motivation you can find for not telling yourself some of the stories that we see very commonly told in the media, which is all these people who have different political views from me, it's because they're evil. It's because they're fueled by pure hate. And listen, I tell this to all sides of the political spectrum. I don't care who it is. That's not a rational way to go about things. If you identify a single individual who is motivated by pure hate, we could talk about that. But very rarely have I seen any evidence for the fact that a mass group of people could be motivated by pure, irredeemable hatred and bigotry. There is often far more complex, nuanced, rational things that are going on despite being wrong. Okay, and I talk about this as someone who's like very opposed to leftist ideology, which promotes this idea that we're all being exploited by these capitalist rich people, and if only we seized their businesses and seized all the property, then we would live in a utopia because we would run everything. Well, we have seen how that plays out in history, and it leads to mass famine, poverty, and death. And yet, when I see people around me who espouse these ideas, I don't think that they're motivated by pure hatred. I think that they have bad information in their operating system. They've adopted this myth that seems like it makes sense, that does offer them some kind of rewarding sentiment. But if they played through the logical conclusion of that, they would probably realize that they would end up in the same place that that myth has taken many societies before, which is destruction. And so I don't know how we get to this place where we take responsibility for our myths, but I think that's ultimately what it is. Like, take responsibility for your myth. It's your story. Don't try to push it on a bunch of other people like it's their story. We need awareness of the fact that we are telling stories. And nowhere have I seen storytelling go wild than in the legacy media and, of course, in social media. What are we doing? Like, Instagram stories. It's literally called Instagram stories. We are telling stories. That's what we are doing largely. We're not writing sourced dissertations and running experiments that are double-blinded and peer-reviewed. We don't have access to all of that to say what we see going on around us. That's simply not on the day-to-day how we make sense of our world. The way we make sense of our world on a day-to-day basis is by filtering it through the narrative structure that we operate on, the personal myth that we hold. And if you have a myth that doesn't operate well, that has some kinks in it that you haven't worked out, that myth is not going to lead you to a prosperous, productive place. And you see that all the time. So often, it's amazing to see because, like, especially coming from a psychology background as I do, so many of the problems that people have in their individual lives are not because they are in circumstances that they cannot get out of, that they are physically, forcibly in these circumstances that they, no matter what they do, cannot get out of. It's circumstances that they themselves replicate through their own actions. And I am one of those people. I'm not perfect. I have my problems. I have my bad habits. I have my problems that I am trying to work through by making different choices. And yet, so often, I make the same choices because I'm operating off of a belief system, off of a narrative structure that leads me to make the same decisions. And so if you want different outcomes, you must take different decisions. And if you want to take different decisions, you need a different operating system for making those decisions. And as much as that should be informed by facts and the reality of the world, we don't have a perfect direct connection to reality. We have our perception of reality, and that perception is our story. about how reality works. And so that is the thing that is in your control. What is the story you tell yourself about the world? I hope it is a story that has a good, happy ending, because so often we don't take responsibility for our stories and we tell ourselves the story that feels good in the moment, despite the fact that that story does not in any way lead us to a happy conclusion. And so that's where we are. I hope that you will start examining some of the stories that you see around you, because once you realize the degree to which myth plays a role in how we ascertain information, it's kind of scary. Like, I'm gonna keep it real with you. It's a little scary. But it's also a beautiful thing if you take responsibility for that, because that's what I did. And it helped me to live so much better of a life, because you have more wherewithal to deal with stress, hardship, bad news, the chaos of the world, if you are able to filter it through a narrative structure that leads you to a good conclusion. That, okay, nonetheless, there are these bad things, but I still believe that my individual actions toward good things matter. That's a story. That's a story right there. And it is not a story that many people hold. The idea that despite all the bad things that happen in our world, my individual actions toward the good still matter. That is something that you really have to make sure, do I actually believe that? Because if you're like me, you did not start out with that operating system. And if you're like many people, you look around you at all the news about this country bombing that country, this country having a war, that country having a famine, here in our own country, all this divisiveness, all this violence that happens, all this difficulty that people are going through. And you might very well feel impotent, that your individual actions, trying to do a good thing, oh, I'm going to go to the gym today, oh, I'm trying to write a book, or I'm going to go to my job as a teacher or as an accountant, and I don't know, like, I guess this makes the world better. Very easy to not feel like your individual actions make a difference when we are given so much information about these grand collective calamities in the world. All the more reason why you need a myth, a personal myth by which you come to the conclusion that despite all these bad things that happen in the world, my individual actions toward good still matter. And so I leave you with that. Examine your personal myth. Take responsibility for your myths. That's going to be my catchphrase. I like that. And don't forget to subscribe to We the Black Sheep so you don't miss any of these other live streams. And I will catch you on the next one. Thank you for joining.